Good morning/good afternoon to everybody. My name is Dawn Sueoka, and I'm the Congressional Papers Archivist at the University of Hawaii at Manoa Library. Thank you to all of you folks for being here today, and thank you to Martha for being our featured speaker this morning. And just to share, the Hawai'i Congressional Papers Collection holds the archives of many of Hawaii's post-statehood members of Congress, including the papers of Senator Daniel Inouye, the papers of Senator Hiram Fong, Senator Spark Matsunaga, and Senator Daniel Akaka. And every year, our collection offers a $5,000 award to a UH Manoa graduate student and a $5,000 travel award to a non-Oahu-based researcher to support research in one or more of our congressional collections. And the recipient of the 2023-24 Travel Award is Martha Cheng. So today, Martha's going to be speaking with us, sharing about her research in the Spark Matsunaga papers. So she'll speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A after that. And we're asking attendees to please put their questions in the chat. And Library and Information Science graduate student Morgan Schmidt is here, and she's going to help me monitor the chat. With that, I'd like to introduce Martha. So Martha, pretend I'm giving you a lei if we were here all in person. Martha Cheng is a professor of rhetoric and writing at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. Her research investigates discourse as constitutive of identity and community in the public sphere, most recently focusing on governmental apologies for historical wrongs. She teaches courses on political speech, crisis communication, language and culture, writing, and Asian American literature and culture. And yes, welcome, Martha. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you. Aloha, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you all for coming today. I appreciate you making the time to come and share my research talk. Thank you to Dawn for all the help at and to the Hawai'i Congressional Papers for the opportunity to do work there and to work there last summer. And I also want to do a shout out to Donovan Balderrama, who is not here today, but who worked and helped me also in the archives when I was there. So yes, today I'm talking about victim and ally voices surrounding government apologies, and specifically focusing on the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And hoping my slides will, there we go. On August 10th, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, providing an apology and monetary redress to Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated without due process during World War II. The law also provided funds for public education so that this violation of constitutional rights would not be forgotten. The Civil Liberties Act is one example of a government apology for an historical wrong. In the last 30 or so years, governments worldwide have been issuing such apologies for wrongs they've committed against their own citizens and those of other nations. There have been so many apologies that some have even called the recent decades the age of apology. Such apologies have been deemed necessary for a government's moral legitimacy, ongoing diplomatic relations, and racial reconciliation. Not surprisingly, scholars from various disciplines have studied this trend carefully and have debated the long-term value and effects of such apologies. One critical concern is that the apologies might be seen as an end in themselves, that once an apology is offered, the problem is solved, with no real systemic lasting changes to the practices that enabled the initial wrong. Thus, government apologies might also be vehicles to allow existing power structures to persist. In the field of rhetoric, which studies persuasive public communication, scholars have focused on the apology's rhetorical form, the ways the language and strategies of the text produce a successful apology. However, studies of specific perceivable audience attitudes towards the apologies are lacking. Thus, my research asks, what is the role of these victim communities in the apology process, and how do they receive such apologies? And I also wonder, how do they incorporate those apologies or not into their histories and ongoing efforts for racial justice? In this presentation, I focus on the first two questions with regards to the Civil Liberties Act, using materials from Senator Spark Matsunaga's papers. These papers provide specific examples of how redress came about, in part through grassroots efforts of individuals and interested organizations. Specifically, victims and organizations use their respective authority positions to evaluate discrete aspects of incarceration, highlighting what they felt were the most egregious issues and what was most in need of repair. The papers also show an extremely positive reception in the immediate aftermath of the passage of the law. Trying to forward my slide here for a second. Oops, I don't know why my slide is not forwarding. Okay, so these are my questions. I had to go manual here. Okay. Provide a background on apology. Second, I will discuss audience reception studies, my close reading method based on the concept of stance. Next, I'll provide a brief history of the Japanese American incarceration and the redress movement. Then I'll move to discuss Senator Matsunaga's papers and then provide a preliminary analysis followed by discussion. According to psychiatrist Aaron Lazare, who authored the book On Apology, victims need the wrong acknowledged, the reassurance that they were not at fault, that they are now safe, that the perpetrators share their values, and that corrective action will prevent future harm. Collective apologies for historical wrongs have the added potential of impacting historical records. As one scholar notes, an official apology acknowledges that history matters. Perpetrators and immediate victims may be gone, but their legacy continues to shape the present. Additionally, such apologies implicitly or explicitly contain the hope that such violations will not be repeated. The scholarship widely agrees that effective apologies require, at a minimum, an unambiguous acknowledgement of the wrong, an expression of mortification, usually signaled by the word sorry or apologize, and corrective action, meaning a commitment to not recommit the wrong and/or concrete steps to repair the damage done. In this political cartoon, we see Uncle Sam apologizing to a multi-generational family leaving an incarceration camp. When studying apologies, rhetoricians and communication scholars concerned with successful public speech typically focus on how the speaker or writer should construct the apology to meet the needs of the victims. Thus, government apologies are typically evaluated based on normative criteria of what makes a good apology, just as we've listed here. But their actual reception and success are usually discussed only in terms of media commentary, which may in turn cite a few representatives of the victim community. So some rhetorical scholars have critiqued the field for being too text-focused and not studying actual audiences, instead using speculative theoretical constructions of the audience. These critics argue that actual audiences should be studied, where they provide an opportunity to examine the rhetorical interpretive labor done by those audiences, foregrounding the active participation of audiences and the dialogic nature of any rhetorical act. In the case of the Civil Liberties Act, it is clear that the wrong community was not simply receiving the apology, but also the driving force behind it. The dearth of audience reception studies is due in part to the limited access to audience reactions, but archival materials surrounding a legislative apology can provide contemporary secondary texts, those naturally occurring responses that audiences have created for themselves. Then, through a close reading of those responses, we can see how text and historical context result in audience reception. I perform my close reading through the lens of the related sociolinguistic concepts of stance and positioning. So I'm going to provide you a definition of stance. One sociolinguist states, stance is a public act by a social actor achieved dialogically through overt communicative means of simultaneously evaluating objects, positioning subjects, self and others, and aligning with other subjects. It's a mouthful. In a more informal definition, stance can be understood as I evaluate something and therefore position myself and thereby align with you or not. So in terms of the archival materials related to the Civil Liberties Act, the concept of stance helps us consider, who is the speaker or writer, and how do they position themselves? What objects are they evaluating? And are they in agreement and alignment with others? So before we move into the materials, let me give you a brief overview of the incarceration of the Japanese Americans during World War II. 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, President D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced removal of Japanese Americans in the Western United States from their homes and their incarceration in what the government called relocation centers. Over 120,000 persons, close to 70,000 of them American citizens, were incarcerated without charge or due process, but simply because of their ethnic background. Japanese Americans remained incarcerated throughout the war, with the last camp closing in March 1946. The years of mass incarcerations not only denied Japanese Americans free movement, but also caused them to lose money, property, and educational and career opportunities. They also contributed to anti-Japanese sentiments during and after the war, creating many challenges for Japanese Americans as they re-entered society and tried to rebuild their lives. Among those challenges was the lingering shame of incarceration and their damaged trust in their country. Years after the war, beginning in 1970, the Japanese American Citizens League, an advocacy group focused on Asian American civil rights, formally endorsed a resolution to seek redress from the US government for the wartime incarceration. In the years following, they worked with Senators Daniel Inouye and Spark Matsunaga and others to achieve redress. A significant step toward redress was the formation of the Commission of Wartime Relocation and Incarceration of Civilians in 1980, which was charged by the federal government with studying the reasoning behind Executive Order 9066 and the subsequent experiences of the Japanese Americans incarcerated. In December 1982, the commission published its report, Personal Justice Denied, which found that, quote, the promulgation of Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The next year, the commission issued recommendations, including an apology from the government, a $20,000 payment to each survivor, and funds for public educational materials on the history of incarceration. The commission's findings and recommendations formed the basis of House Resolution 442, sponsored by Representative Thomas Foley, and Senate Bill 1009, sponsored by Senator Matsunaga, legislation that would become the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. There are several excellent studies that describe how the long struggle for redress finally resulted in the Civil Liberties Act. The legislative process included skillful political leadership, the framing of the issue as constitutional, a lack of coherent opposition, and widespread individual and organizational support. While the legislative effort was underway, another group, the National Council for Japanese American Redress, worked through the judicial system, filing class action lawsuits against the government. Although this effort wasn't ultimately successful, it reached the Supreme Court and was widely covered by the media. Scholars seem to agree that this simultaneous lawsuit contributed to the passage of the Civil Liberties Act. It did so by further educating lawmakers, the media, and the public about the experiences of Japanese Americans. Scholars of Japanese American history, and indeed those with any familiarity with the redress movement, know that it was a multifaceted effort with individuals, organizations, and legislators working on various fronts to move redress forward. Despite this reality, rhetorical scholarship has yet to consider the significance of the grassroots efforts in understanding the Civil Liberties Act and its perceived success. While the evaluations of the language and form of text are important, the continuing centering of the text, the actual apology text, and its official author, the government, overlooks the victim's role in the process. The materials and Senator Matsunaga's papers can help partially fill that gap. As a leader in the redress movement and co-sponsor of the Civil Liberties Act, Senator Matsunaga was not only a member of the victim community, but also instrumental in achieving passage of the law. His papers in the Hawai'i Congressional Collection offer us contemporary secondary texts related to the Civil Liberties Act in the form of letters from constituents, from organizations and cultural groups, state and local governments, and colleagues from the late 1970s through the 1988, the year of passage, and immediately after. Specifically, many individuals who were members of the Japanese American community who were survivors or descendants of survivors wrote to him. Likewise, activist groups such as the Japanese American Citizens League were in continual communication with him. Although the papers only provide a partial view of audience involvement in and reception of the law's passage, they do give us previously uninvestigated qualities of that audience and their attitudes towards the law. In my analysis, I look first at the letters and testimonies from individuals, followed by the letters and resolutions written by organizations. I focus on individual and organizational positioning and the most prominent stance objects they comment on and evaluate. A common pattern in the letters or testimonies is for the speaker or writer to first introduce themselves and offer some warrant for their right to speak. That is, they identify themselves as formerly incarcerated or the children of incarcerated and emphasize the accuracy and weight of their memories. By beginning their letters and testimonies in this way, they establish their authority to speak. Such positioning reflects epistemic privilege, a concept from feminist standpoint theory, in which those with direct experience of oppression would have a privileged standpoint from which to understand it and the social forces and realities surrounding it. In this example, from a testimony at a hearing in Hawaii, the speaker says, "I am so-and-so, the last of 7 children of my father, who was one of 29 men in Group 6 from Hawaii incarcerated at the Santa Fe camp, New Mexico, as a result of Executive Order 9066. After 42 years, my memories of the day that my father was forcibly taken by the FBI from our home in Kauai are as vivid as if it happened yesterday." Similarly, in this testimony, here we go. In this testimony, the writer begins by describing himself prior to incarceration. "In the fall of 1941, I was a U.S. citizen, a reserve officer of the U.S. Army Infantry, a law-abiding 30-year-old University of Washington first-year law student with solid dreams to return with a law degree in my hand to my home, family, and friends in Hawaii. But suddenly, without warning, from that fateful February 1942, when Executive Order 9066 was signed, that young man was no more." One grandmother, writing in 1987, shares with Senator Matsunaga that she discovered that her granddaughter knew very little about evacuation. Her granddaughter said she can't believe it happened. The grandmother responds, "I know it happened, and I know I will never forget." Sometimes the authoritative epistemic positioning of the writer is less explicit. In this example, the writer takes a subtle position of someone with knowledge that his audiences do not possess. He says, since Americans are unaware of what happened to some of the Japanese Americans in Hawaii after December 7th, 1941, I would like to familiarize you with what took place, specifically to my family. Later, he again positions himself as someone with knowledge others do not have. It is difficult for the general public to understand the insistence on compensation that has been expressed by most of the Japanese American community. The children and grandchildren of the incarcerated also take on epistemic privilege as witnesses to and recipients of intergenerational trauma. One letter opens with, "As a fourth-generation American of Japanese ancestry, I would like to express my appreciation for your sponsorship of Redress Bill S-1053. Born during the baby boom, I was spared the degradation of being placed in a concentration camp. But my parents' and grandparents' generations still bear the scars." This epistemic privilege allows the writers to bear witness to what happened in their community. By writing their senator or testifying before the commissions, these members enact their agency in addressing the wrong done. They demand to be seen and heard and their experiences to be acknowledged. They do so without hedging their knowledge or authority, but rather emphasize their right to speak, and they present their knowledge in categorical statements. The archives indicate that Senator Matsunaga responded to these letters, thanking their writers for sharing their experiences and updating them on the status of legislation. In addition to positioning, I looked at what persons, acts, or entities the speaker or writer is commenting on or evaluating. These stance objects highlight the writer's driving concerns and issues and speak to their justifications for redress, providing insight into the point of view of the victim community and their needs that must be met in the apology. The individuals orient first to the actual redress bills going through the legislative process. Two other prominent objects are the losses of property and livelihood, and finally, the United States itself. The prominence of the financial losses speak to the need for compensation beyond a verbal apology, and the commentary of the United States speaks to the moral imperative for the U.S. to correct itself. In 1987, a constituent emphatically expressed support for the redress legislation, and the typographical emphasis here was in the original. He says, "Dear Senator, I would like to express my sincere support and deep concern for S-1009, the redress bill. It is a fundamental American issue. Does our Constitution stand for justice and equality or not? It takes a great country to admit a mistake, Senator Matsunaga, and attempt to make restitution. I believe our country is great." Together, the many letters over the years show individuals deeply invested in the status of redress legislation. They position themselves as staunch supporters of the bill and urge lawmakers to pass redress. A second significant stance object writers address was the financial losses they suffered. Many of the letters from the former incarcerated or their children detailed what was taken from them and the harsh manner in which it was done. In this letter, the author writes, "My brothers and sisters can recall the traumatic experience of my father being forced by duress to sign the deed, transferring his property to the United States government. He was never even accused of siding with the enemy, nor given a chance to temporarily permit the government to use the property, but merely forced to give up something, which he and my mother had literally broken their backs to acquire, just because he was Japanese and the enemy was Japanese." Another writer reflects on his grandfather's farm. He says, "The land on which his farm stood is now worth several $100,000. He and his family worked hard and they lost it all. I'm saddened that he died without the US government ever apologizing to him." The financial losses and incarcerations had severely shaken the Japanese Americans community's relationship and trust in their government. Thus, the third prominent stance object is the United States itself. One letter writer described incarceration as America's worst World War II error. Without trial or hearing, without warrant, we were deprived of our liberty. losing our homes, farms, businesses, and careers, an event unprecedented in American history. America lost its way when it incarcerated Japanese in concentration camps. Another pleaded, please help us defend individual freedom and due process for all Americans now and in the future. And this writer hoped the redress bill would prevent similar violations in the future. He states, what is important in the future is that future generations will be reminded that such frightening acts can occur if we are not ever mindful of our Constitution and the American ideal of the respect for the dignity of the human being. In their letters and testimonies, the individuals bore witness to their experiences, strongly supported the legislation, and showed how the evacuation caused irreparable financial losses and damaged the integrity of the United States. In addition to the individual correspondence, I looked at materials sent by organizations. So many government, civil, cultural, religious, and professional groups actively lobbied lawmakers for redress. In one document in the archives, they have a list of organizations that endorsed the redress bill. And you can see here we have 7 national government bodies, which would be something like the Congressional Black Caucus, 19 statewide bodies, which would be like the state of Hawaii, 14 county-wide governmental bodies. So the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors wrote in, and et cetera. It goes on, 19, like labor organizations, veterans groups, or religious organizations. It was just an overwhelming and diverse group that was supporting redress and actively lobbying for it. So by taking a stand on the issue and by writing lawmakers, these groups emphasize the point of redress for Japanese American incarceration was not only a Japanese issue, but rather a broader issue of civil, constitutional, and human rights. And while these groups did not have the epistemic privilege of direct experience, they positioned themselves with authority most obviously by writing in an official voice on letterhead with their organizational titles. But at times, they also appealed to their professional expertise to speak to the issues surrounding redress. For example, the American Bar Association letter states, members of the American Bar Association feel a special duty to ensure the integrity of our basic freedoms. And the American Psychological Association Society for the Psychological Study of Ethnic Minority Issues wrote that, as psychologists, we have a professional interest in the social psychological harm that racial injustice has had on ethnic minority groups in the United States. It is in this light that we urge you to support the Civil Liberties Act of 1987. Thus, they focus more on the constitutional violations, but also given that monetary redress was quite controversial and made many lawmakers hesitant to support the legislation, many of the organizations explicitly endorsed the $20,000 payment. The organization's correspondence sent between 1987 and 1988 specifically mentioned the $20,000 payment. For example, the Church of the Brethren wrote to all the members of the House of Representatives saying, we feel that financial compensation is essential for the redress to have meaning. The $20,000 for each person that would be authorized by the legislation is, in our judgment, a modest amount. Beyond writing these letters, what else could such organizations do to express their support? Well, many government bodies and organizations passed official resolutions, documents first detailing the facts around incarceration, and then their group's reasoning supporting redress. Once that is written up, the group formally votes to accept the resolution, which then becomes part of the group's official record. The formal vote backing up these resolutions indicate the group's commitment and strong stance on the issue. As early as 1979, the Conference of Western Attorneys General passed a resolution stating that the support of the constitutional rights of citizens of the United States and the principle of democracy is a matter of major concern. Therefore, they support in principle the campaign of the National Council for Japanese American Redress to obtain reasonable compensation for the injuries and losses suffered by Japanese American evacuees, detainees, and internees. In 1984, the Veterans of Foreign Wars Department of North Dakota passed Resolution 24, in which they go on record to continue to protect the civil rights and constitutional guarantees of all Americans. And it continues to champion the rights of all and the rights of citizenship will never, and that the rights of citizenship will never depend on race or ancestry. So the organizations relied on their group status and their professional expertise in positioning themselves to argue for redress. They foregrounded the need to protect constitutional rights and restore the US's integrity. And they were well aware of the need to argue for monetary compensation. When the legislation was finally passed on August 10th, 1988, Senator Matsunaga received many letters of thanks, congratulations, celebration, and expressions of what the apology and redress meant to individual Japanese Americans. One woman, evidently very excited, wrote to Matsunaga, Senator Matsunaga, as Reagan was signing the bill. Dear Mr. Matsunaga, congratulations on this momentous day. As I type this, President Reagan is signing the approval to your historic legislation, providing for the apology and compensation to us internees during World War II. This day I will never forget. Another constituent wrote, as I read of the passage of the reparations bill, I wish to thank you for your courage in pushing this through. As a sensei, it's third generation Japanese American, I truly appreciate your restoring the dignity that was taken from the Issei and Issei. As a father, I have renewed confidence for my children that they are living in a great country that has the courage to say, we were wrong. Another whose father and uncle were put in military prison after the bombing of Pearl Harbor wrote to the senator saying, it is not the monetary awarding of money, but the apology of the US government that is most significant to the older generation of Japanese people that suffered this wrong. To correct a mistake by admitting the injustice of it to the Japanese Americans may prevent future occurrences of similar nature to any American citizen of any race or ethnic group. And finally, one high schooler wrote to him, calling the law our very triumphant victory. It has been a monumental victory for justice and civil rights in the United States. I'm already anticipating the day when my 96-year-old great-grandmother will receive her formal apology and just desserts. These letters express joy, relief, the lifting of shame in the immediate aftermath of the law's passage. They reflect the deep personal meaning of the successful redress, including the healing it can provide the older generations. In the many letters, writers celebrate the victory. Some emphasize the monetary compensation, others the apology, and others their renewed faith in the United States. And then almost immediately after passage, Senator Matsunaga received letters asking about the process to receive redress payments. So after August 1988, then his office started the pragmatic work of how do people get redress, and many, many constituents wrote to him and he guided them through that process. To sum up and gather some thoughts here, some who are skeptical of government apologies fear that they can be seen as an end in themselves, that the problem is solved and that the dominant forces that enable the historical wrong remain in place. But now, because of the apology, those forces seem absolved. In this sense, apologies might even be a tool of oppressive forces. The field of rhetoric might inadvertently reinforce the notion of apology as an end in itself when it focuses on the apology's linguistic form and normative criteria. In that perspective, the government and its representatives are agents, while the victims are passive recipients. But those familiar with the history of Japanese American redress understand that that is not the case. The archival materials from one of the key legislators and a member of the victim community provide us with insight into the many-layered agency of the victim community and their reception and attitudes toward the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. These contemporary secondary texts brought in what scholars can study when investigating apology, going beyond the text itself. This broadening reveals the victim's specific perceivable attitudes towards the wrongs, the wrongdoers, and themselves. It also highlights the personally transformative aspect of reparation programs, practically experienced by many. For many, going through the process of fighting for redress was highly significant. Through the testimonies and letters, they bore witness to experiences of incarceration and expressed what was most significant to them about the meaning of those experiences. With their epistemic privilege, they actively pushed to be heard. In these letters and testimonies, we see that those wronged are agents with capacities and powers to be used in the aftermath of crime. Further, the Japanese American community had many allies in government, civic, cultural, religious, and professional groups who also actively lobbied lawmakers throughout the redress effort. Thus, while Congress and the president ultimately wrote and approved the apology, the effort for redress within the Japanese American community and beyond it raises the question of agency. Instead of studying government apologies as acts by the government and framing research questions from the government's point of view, how can we expand our research if we see governmental apology as an outcome of actions by the victim communities and as a part of a larger ongoing process rather than an end in itself? Thank you. And I'm happy to entertain questions if anything was unclear or to go back to a slide if anybody would like me to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Martha. And I really appreciate that kind of reframing that you proposed. That's really, really exciting. And so now I just want to remind folks, you're welcome to put questions in the chat. LIS graduate student Morgan Schmidt will be managing the chat and the Q&A. But before I hand things over to her, I had a question for you, Martha. In your analysis of letters that individuals from the victim community, those with the kind of direct experience, in those letters, did you notice to any degree that they were kind of acknowledging Senator Matsunaga's identity as a Japanese American and wanting to use that kind of commonality as a kind of leverage point? Did that come up at all or not?
They not as much as you would have thought, right? I think they did not appeal to his history as a member of the 442 or his Japanese American heritage. It was almost as if they were already familiar with him, right? And so that was a known thing and didn't need to be established. That's my sense. In their positioning with him, what they did the most was thank him and say how grateful they were over and over and over again. And so that's a whole nother stance object, just like their admiration for him and his efforts. And in a way, I almost saw it as them encouraging him to keep up the fight, right? But I did not see them kind of make the move of, hey, we're all part of this same community. I did not see that very often.
Go ahead, Morgan.
Okay, well, thank you, Martha. That was a wonderful talk, and thanks for sharing some of the material you discovered, and some great things to think about. So I do see a question here in the chat from Karen, who writes, "I'm curious about the timing of your research. What prompted you to investigate this archival material now?"
Good. Hi, Karen. So I'm so glad you're here. For those, Karen and I we got our masters together. So back in the day. So thanks for joining.
And you work at my undergraduate alma mater too.
Yes,
So
yes, we have
lots
many
of connections there.
And Karen is also a rhetorician. So I've kind of found my way to these. I archives. I was initially just studying political apologies in general, right? And just some of their moves, and was getting into that. And I've done some work on that. And then I noticed there was a pattern of, especially in the last few years during the pandemic, apologies to Asian American communities. And so I think that was a response to the hate crimes and such, that communities were starting to say, hey, we have to acknowledge the past discrimination and racist issues in our communities, so let's start apologizing. So then my project is really looking at all of those and seeing what patterns we can find in apologies to Asian American communities. And the two federal ones are this one, and the apology resolution to Native Hawaiians for the annexation, which, while I was at the archives, I also researched. So the timing, I guess you could say, is somewhat prompted by the pandemic and what was going on, and going back to see how our country has dealt with its past behavior towards Asian American communities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we are working on getting the Akaka papers processed and hopefully eventually ready. So eventually, you know, maybe if you want to come back and do more research onto for the Native Hawaiian apology resolution, then, you know, we'll be here for you.
Well, the Daniel Inouye papers had a lot too.
That's true. Yeah, of course.
Nice.
All right. So anyone else, feel free to add questions, but I do have some prepared. So in the meantime, as we're waiting for other questions, I'll go ahead and ask. So I'm sure there were so many fascinating items within the Matsunaga papers, but do you want to share one particularly interesting or a surprising piece that you discovered and that really stuck with you?
I was really surprised by the number of organizations and groups that were involved, that were not affiliated with Japanese American groups in any way, right? So like, you know, there were just so many various professional organizations, such as the American Psychological Association, right? They had a quite long, detailed letter and argued for it. So it wasn't just like, oh yes, we're writing to support this legislation. They took the time to really research it. You could tell from the letters that they were very well aware what was in the legislation, that they were following the process, and they were taking the time to discuss it as an organization and to then lobby on behalf of the legislation. And the resolutions too also really surprised me when you think about how resolutions come about, the process of studying the issue, coming to an agreement, and educating the people in the organization and coming to an agreement, developing the language for the resolution, voting on it, putting it in the record, and then sending that all to people in Congress. Like, it was not a small thing for them to do this, to advocate for Japanese American internees, the formerly incarcerated. So that really impressed me, and actually gave me a lot of hope and the idea that these issues have broader allies than we might think initially, right? It's not just the JACL group advocating, Japanese Americans group advocating, but it can be much broader.
That's a wonderful point, and I think very heartening. You know, you're not alone in that, right? Yeah.
It is heartening.
And then I saw that Dawn posted in the comments the primary source set link. So thank you, Dawn. So please feel free to visit that and take a look at some of these scans of the sources. And I'll move on to my, oh yeah, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. If you click on that link, you'll see some documents, right, from these papers. And the ones I really enjoyed were the handwritten letters from constituents. And, you know, and then you see the ones typewriter written, dot matrix printed. Like, you see the journey to read just was so long, you kind of track the technology too, which is really interesting. But yeah, I feel you get much more of a flavor of the text if you go to the primary source site.
Absolutely. And I'm very glad that all those are up online. Before I get to the next question, I'll say that as I was looking through some of the folders to scan, like rescan these materials, I mean, I just in the few folders I looked in, there was so much material. There were so many like letters from, teachers who had like Japanese American students whose families had been interned, like letters from various organizations. I mean, there's just a wealth of stuff, very valuable material that is amazing.
Right. And so I think the point, there's a very prominent scholar, Yamamoto, who talks about reparations and studies them. His point is that these acts can be personally transformative, right? Like, and that's what we don't see, we can't see without going to these individual archives and these types of things, and that can bring a value to it that is often unrecognized in the more theoretical discussions of apology.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, and I see a new question from Peter, who writes, it seems like the critique of apologies as quote unquote end in themselves is a way of saying they're mostly, oh gosh, I'm not sure I'm gonna get this pronunciation of this word right.
Epidite.
Thank you. I apologize. So would you consider redress more forensic or deliberative?
So it seems like are you distinguishing the monetary payment?
All right, I'll appear here. Yeah, I just when you talked about the critique of apologies as just being an end in themselves, it seemed kind of like the complaint is that they're just ceremonial. They're merely ceremonial. There's no effort to kind of get to the bottom of anything or
Right.
make a legislative correction or a remedy or something like that. I don't know. I'm just wondering if that's an appropriate way to categorize these two things or not, and what your perspective on that would be.
That's interesting. I have thought of these apologies as epideictic, and by epideictic, remissions mean purely ceremonial, like performative, right? And so that would be the danger, like the government is just acting sorrowful, but nothing changes.
Right.
Okay. And Peter's asking, would redress be more like deliberative is like solving the problem, right? Like actually doing something. And I think what's interesting is in the case of the Civil Liberties Act, there was money and there was for individuals and there was money for educational fund, which that money has funded museums, oral history projects, educational curriculum, like it's done work. So it's been very effective in keeping the issue in people's minds, I think, and the history there. Whether it's really changed how the government deals with minority groups is another question. But I think the money and the corrective action written into the law is very important to why this piece was successful. And throughout the arguments for this, from individuals receiving it to legislators, everyone notes that the money can never pay for the harm done. It's not even equal. It's almost like, can you dispense with a moral obligation by just paying money? That can be a problematic issue, but it's tangible, right? With just an apology, with nothing else, it's just mere words, right? So because it was tangible, corrective action, and because there was the educational money too, I think it was successful. And yeah, maybe it's useful to think about it as epideictic versus deliberative. I'd have to think about that a little more. Interestingly, the apology to Native Hawaiians had no redress, no corrective action, and actually had a disclaimer that the apology could not be used in any suit to sue the government for anything. Okay.
Wow.
So Right. So the long-term outcomes and acceptance of that apology, I think, are quite different from the Japanese American because of that. So yeah. But thanks for that question. I'll think about that, Peter.
Great, thank you.
Maybe I'll add it to my next paper.
Just a thought.
Yes.
I'm just thinking
Yeah.
about that. Cheers. Thanks
Yeah.
for the great talk.
Thanks.
Take care.
Yeah, well, really good question, I think, and really really thought-provoking answer. So thank you. I see one more question from Karen. It might be just kind of adding on to that, but she writes, I wonder if speech act therapy, particularly perlocution, I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly, would shine an interesting light on Peter's question, both on the words of the apologizers and those seeking the apology.
Yeah, there's been a lot of speech act theory used to analyze apology. I just can't fit it all in this, you know. And like I said, this is I think these documents are so rich and there's so much going on. It was actually like I tried a few different ways of how to approach it, and I think I'm still working that out. And I think this will keep developing, but yes, speech act theory is definitely a useful lens.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you know, when Peter was talking about just empty words and that does this really mean anything? And certainly the people pushing for the apology by writing letters and this sort of thing had a result to their words. And maybe the apology itself in some of the letters that were written after the fact seemed to show that maybe there was some effect of the written apology. It's hard to separate, though, like you were saying, how much of the effect was the written apology and how much of the effect was the monetary redress. So that's a little bit of a complicating factor, but there is that idea that words can, you know, have an effect on an audience,
Right.
not just be empty. So yeah.
Right. Well, that one quote said, right, the apology is more important for the older generation, right?
Mhm.
So I think the individuals receiving the apology have different perspectives. Some value the money more, some value the apology more, right? Some value that just, you know, that the government could admit a mistake was tremendous for them, right? So there were all these different takes on it. So thanks, Karen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martha. I saw Don also posted, Don, thank you for posting these links. The link to the Congressional Papers Research Fellowship and Travel Award. So if you know any researchers or any student researchers who might be interested, please feel free to share that link with them. I believe Don was saying that applications are open now. Is that correct? Okay.
When are
Yeah,
they
so
due, Dawn?
Till March 20th.
Okay. It's a great opportunity. I highly recommend it.
We have time for a couple more questions. So I'll ask one more from my prepared list. And of course, if anyone has a question, please feel free to write it in. So Martha, how do you think being more attuned to the voices of victims, so through their letters or their testimony, how do you think that can help us to better understand the redress or the apology process?
I think what's missing in a lot of scholarship now, as I'm trying to argue here, is the voice of the victims, right? And not appreciating that these apologies would never happen if the victims didn't push for it, right? Like on an interpersonal level, individuals might feel guilt for something they did and then apologize unprompted by whoever they wronged, right? We can just by our own guilt feel like we need to apologize. That's doubtful at the governmental level, right? In a collective way. I think the only way a government is moved, and this is just my thinking, to apologize to a group formally, legislatively, is to be pushed by that group.
Sure.
And I think that point is overlooked, right? So that the apology is really an outcome of the agency of the victims, not some sentiment by the government, right? It's almost the victims are having to teach the government what they did wrong and what the value is and why they should do this, right? And in a way, the effort of the government doing it is the last piece, but it's the work before that is all the activism of the victim groups. And so I just think that's not, at least in my field, not talked about, right? I think if you read the literature on Japanese American redress, that's very obvious. But as rhetoricians, we've been kind of enamored of the text, and I think broadening that out can just help us understand how the entire rhetorical situation is affecting the phenomenon that we're witnessing.
Wonderful, thank you. My last question, so do you think that the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 can be considered a model for government apologies? I mean, I'm sure this will not be the last group that, you know, will you know, deserve an apology.
Right.
Certainly isn't the first.
I think there are really good lessons that can be taken from it. And, you know, right now there are a lot of groups advocating for African-American reparations, and former Japanese American activists for redress and their descendants are actually actively working to help African-Americans achieve that. And the state of California has done a study of how to redress African-Americans and appeals to and cites this law, the Civil Liberties Act,
Wonderful.
in their work. I think three things I would say are what we can learn in the takeaways from the Civil Liberties Act and why it was so successful. The hearings for the commission, like having the commission of wartime relocation and incarceration for civilians that publicly gave witness and voice to victims and to what happened factually, right? So the media covered it, people started talking about it. It just came to national consciousness, really. Even though, well, I was going to say I was alive at that time in the East Coast, never heard about it, right? It depends on, but on the West Coast, like it was very much in the, I think, consciousness. The media covered it a lot because of that. And so when the commission's report came out, and it was very well-respected panel that ran the commission, it was bipartisan, it was, that was accepted as fact. Like their findings were just accepted as fact. I mean, there were a few who opposed and wrote op-eds and everything. It was just accepted as fact. So one thing that I thought was interesting in the materials I've looked at, no one debates what happened. No one debates the you know, and the organizations, because they didn't have that direct experience, they just appealed to the commission's findings. They just used the commission's language over and over and over again. So I think that study was a crucial, I don't think it was a crucial step to success. I don't think it would have been successful without the study. And so that having that kind of study before fighting for the redress, I think is important. The other is some kind of tangible compensation and some kind of ongoing educational effort. But like I said, I think the government still has problems in how they relate to minority communities. So that's a piece that we still haven't addressed. And I would honestly say the other thing that impressed me when going through this is how bipartisan the support was and how much the legislators worked together and across the aisle. And it was really nice to see, but then I thought, can that happen today? I don't know.
That's the question.
Yeah, like I think our political landscape has changed. And I'm just, we might have to work differently now. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Martha. And I don't see any other questions, and I think we're just about at the end of our time. So I'll pass it back to Dawn to close out.
Thanks, Morgan.
All right, thank you, folks. the comment from Donovan in the chat, but thank you all for being here. And look forward to seeing you folks at another Congressional Papers talk in the future. So, aloha.
Aloha. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your coming and your attention and your comments and questions. Thanks. Bye. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you.